Yo, what is going on, APUSH peeps? We have Chapter 20 of America's History for you today. This one I'm using the 8th edition, but as always, it'll match up with other editions that you have. Let's get started. So we're going to focus on reform visions from 1880 to 1892. Talking about electoral politics after Reconstruction, what we see is that Congress actually shifts control between Republicans and Democrats quite often during this time period. It goes back and forth a lot. One thing to keep in mind, really throughout most of its political history, Republicans want to raise tariffs. And you see Republican with an R, and you see raise with an R. Republicans raise, Republicans raise. Republicans want to raise tariffs. Republicans want to raise tariffs. Conversely, what direction do you think Democrats want them to go in? Democrats begins with a D and down. Republicans raise, Democrats down. Please remember that. So we have this term, the Gilded Age, we touched on before. This saw political corruption and a large gap between the rich and the poor. So James Garfield, one of my favorite presidents, I read a fantastic book on him called Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard. It is my favorite book ever. He was shot 4 months into office, and sadly for him, he died 2 months later in September of 1881. So his administration is the second shortest in American history. Now, shortly after, in 1883, his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, who becomes president upon Garfield's death, passes the Pendleton Act, and this required many government jobs to be filled by a civil service test, and this helped limit spoils system. Part of the reason was the guy who shot Garfield proclaimed afterwards, "I am a stalwart," and Chester A. Arthur is now president. So he killed Garfield partly because he's mentally insane, but he also had hoped that Garfield would give him a job. Mugwumps were the names for liberal Republicans that did not support candidate James G. Blaine in 1884. And Grover Cleveland became president, and he is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, and he also vetoed more bills than any president in U.S. history. He signed the Interstate Commerce Act, which sought to limit the power of corporations, especially railroads. Okay, let's talk about Republican activism. We have the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which sought to limit corporations, and the wording of it forbid combinations in the form of trust or otherwise. And lawyers are really going to focus on that term, otherwise. Ironically, lawyers will use that to help curb the power of unions, not corporations. And many of the first suits brought forth by the Sherman Antitrust Act, they were used to go against unions and not corporations, because they said that unions were a combination that helped restrict trade. The Lodge Bill would allow citizens to ask for government intervention in elections, and this did not pass. This would have helped African Americans. Now we're going to talk about the populist program. Absolutely positively know this. It's mentioned in the new curriculum under Key Concept 6.1, Roman numeral 3, letter C. And this group is made up of predominantly farmers. When you think populist, think farmers. So they had the Omaha platform, and this argued that people should have more of a say in government. And it was written by this dude with probably the sweetest name ever, Ignatius-Donnelly. And they called for the public ownership of railroads and telegraphs and a federal income tax for the wealthy. And they also wanted to loosen the money supply, which would help out borrowers and those in debt, who predominantly tended to be farmers. So they called for the introduction of silver into the money supply, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Okay, the Panic of 1893 saw high unemployment and an incredible amount of bank failures, and Coxey's army marched to Washington, D.C. It was nicknamed Coxey's Army. It was led by a former vet, Coxey. And what he called for was the federal government to hire unemployed Americans to fix roads. So he saw this as a way to build the United States' infrastructure and at the same time help out the unemployed. It was not successful, and many saw Coxey as too extreme. He was actually arrested for walking on the grass at the Capitol building. When we're talking about free silver, these are people who favor a looser monetary supply. Instead of just gold backing up the dollar, they want silver to be backed up at a ratio of 16:1, which would increase the amount of money in circulation, which would lead to inflation, which would allow those in debt to pay back their debts more easily. This would help borrowers. The Solid South refers to overwhelmingly voting for the Democratic Party by white Southerners that had tremendous power. It didn't matter who was running for election, chances are in the South, a Democrat would win. If you were to look at electoral maps from this time, you would see they are solidly blue for the Democratic Party. Now, although the grandfather clause was struck down, literacy tests and poll taxes were upheld by the Supreme Court in the South. So this is a way to still discourage and disenfranchise African Americans. And as a result, African American voter turnout plummeted in many southern states. You would also see public hangings and arrests for vagrancy, and many African Americans would be sentenced to chain gang labor. Okay, William Jennings Bryan is a very important dude. I do have a video on the election of 1896. Here he is. He was a populist and Democratic candidate in 1896, and he was a 3-time presidential candidate, and he lost all 3. Who does that sound like? Oh my God, it's my boy Henry Clay. You thought he was gone and not coming back. Oh no, he'll be back a couple more times. There he is. Say hi to Henry. Now, William Jennings Bryan gave a very famous speech called A Cross of Gold, and he called for the free silver platform. Again, you should see this idea that populists want to expand the money supply. In the election of 1896, you have McKinley, who is pro-business. He defeated Bryan. And the Democrats and Republicans increased direct primaries in states. So more power is given to voters in certain states. We see the passage of the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators rather than the legislature. So it used to be senators were elected by state legislatures. Once the 17th Amendment is passed, it allows citizens of a state to vote for their senators. Can you name the 2 senators in your state? If you live in New York like me, that's Chuck Schumer and Kristen Gillibrand. In the Supreme Court case Lochner versus New York, the Supreme Court overturned a New York law limiting bakers' workday to 10 hours. And bakers argued that, hey, if I want to work more than 10 hours, I have that right. This New York State is limiting my right to make a contract. All right, let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt as president. One of the more interesting presidents, I think. He was chosen as VP to McKinley by Republicans to quiet his career. He was really very progressive for a Republican, and he made a lot of people in the Republican Party mad. So they had this idea, they're going to make him vice president and silence him, and it would be a career killer. It will lead to nowhere. And once McKinley is killed, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. He becomes the youngest president in U.S. history in September of 1901. He was actually inaugurated about 20 minutes from my house. It's really cool. If you're ever in Buffalo, go check it out. It's awesome. So let's talk about antitrust legislation. Well, in 1902, we have the anthracite coal mine strike, and Teddy Roosevelt told the owners, if you don't negotiate with the laborers, with the unions, I will seize the mines, I will nationalize them, and let the military work in the mines. The Elkins Act of 1903 made it so railroads could no longer offer cheaper rates to big companies or rebates. They couldn't favor certain groups with shipping. The Northern Security Decisions was a powerful railroad trust led predominantly by J.P. Morgan that was broken up, and it was upheld by the Supreme Court. So this is one of the first trusts that is broken up and upheld. The Hepburn Act gave the ICC power to set shipping rates, and it really gave the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, some teeth, some strength to it, because before, the ICC was not very strong. One of Teddy Roosevelt's most enduring legacies was environmental conservation, and Teddy set aside land for wildlife refuges. He also signed the Newlands Reclamation Act, in which the government sold land out west to raise money for improved irrigation in dry, arid land. So it was a way to populate the West by selling land, and it was also a way to improve certain areas of the country with better irrigation. So what is his legacy? He handpicked Taft to be his successor. And you can see here from this Puck magazine cover, Teddy is holding the baby of my policies and giving it to Taft. And that does not work out well, as we will see. Next, let's talk about the Wisconsin idea by Robert La Follette. Very important, and here he is. He looks a lot like Joe Pesci. If you've ever seen Home Alone, he was the bad guy, the one who dressed up as a cop in the beginning. Doesn't that look like Joe Pesci a little bit? Maybe just shave his head. It's all the same. So what is the Wisconsin idea? Well, it called for increased government involvement in the economy and increased voter participation. That is going to be the key here, voter participation. So how do they do this? Well, one is the recall, in which you can remove elected officials. It's important to know these are state ideas, not federal. So here is Arnold Schwarzenegger. Why do I have Arnold Schwarzenegger? Well, he became governor of California after the previous governor, Gray Davis, was recalled. He was total recalled. Did you get it? Because that was a Schwarzenegger movie? Okay. So we also have the referendum, in which citizens can vote on laws, and the initiative, in which citizens can propose laws. Now, this is part of Key Concept 6.1, Roman numeral 1, letter A. This idea of giving more power back to people to control government. Definitely be familiar with that. Robert Hunter wrote a book called Poverty, in which he argued that poverty was not due to laziness, but rather social problems. And the National Child Labor Committee helped lead to the Children's Bureau. In the Supreme Court case Mueller versus Oregon, the Supreme Court upheld an Oregon law that limited women to 10-hour workdays, and they argued that women needed special protection. And this was argued by Lois Brandeis, who becomes a future Supreme Court justice, and there he is. And the Brandeis brief became well known in Supreme Court cases in the future, and this was supporting arguments by using scientific research. Many states and individuals resisted laws limiting child labor, and mostly because lower income families often relied on income from children to work. They could use all the money they could get. All right, let's talk about diverse progressive goals here. When we're talking about civil rights, a lot of it really goes back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and a key founder was this guy, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African American to receive his PhD from Harvard. Now, he called for something called the Talented Tenth, and he argued for the education of blacks, not just vocational training like Booker T. Washington. He argued that the top 10 of African Americans should have open access to all of society. Now, he was a founding member of the Niagara Movement in Niagara Falls, Canada. And if you look right here, there is W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, the question is, why is it in Canada and not the United States? Do you know? It's because the falls on the U.S. side had segregated hotels, and Niagara Falls, Canada did not. So what was this movement all about? Well, they advocated an end to segregation, increased voter rights, equal economic opportunities, etc. Now, later on, a few years later, we have the development of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, still around today. And this was a civil rights organization, and this was instrumental in many civil rights court cases, including one of the most famous of all time, 1954's Brown versus the Board of Education, which reversed Plessy versus Ferguson. The Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, or the Wobblies, who were also nicknamed I Won't Work, were a labor union, and they used strikes to achieve their goals. And one of their goals was to try to overthrow capitalism. Now, they declined after World War I, because during World War I, they would strike, and many people felt a sense of patriotism during World War I, and that the U.S. should support the war effort. Okay, the election of 1812. Well, Taft is up for re-election, and we'll get to him more in the next chapter. And Roosevelt decides he's going to run again. And he advocated an increase in government control under his new platform called New Nationalism. He also favored women's suffrage. So Teddy did not receive the nomination from the Republicans, so he ran on the Progressive, or the Bull Moose Party. And he was actually given a speech in Wisconsin, I believe it was. And some dude comes up and shoots him right in the chest. And his speech that was folded over absorbed a lot of the bullet, but the bullet did go into his chest, and Teddy Roosevelt went up and gave a speech. And he started this speech by saying, I don't know if you're aware, I just got shot in the chest, but I'm going to keep talking. So it's pretty intense. So two Republicans running against each other, you have Taft and Roosevelt, all but guarantee a victory for Wilson. You see this political cartoon of Taft and Roosevelt fighting for the nomination. We also have another person, Eugene V. Debs, who is a person, not a court case. Don't let that V throw you off. And he ran as a socialist. And what we see during the early 1900s is that socialism is a growing force in America. Now, Wilson, the Democrat, a former governor of New Jersey, president of Princeton, he won with just over 40% of the popular vote. And you can look at this map, and you'll notice that Wilson won a lot of states. Roosevelt came in second, Taft came in third. But really, if Taft or Roosevelt did not run, if it was just one of them, they would have won the election. Okay, some economic reforms under Wilson. We have the progressive income tax, which is a populist idea. That's the 16th Amendment. What that means is the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. Other taxes included the income and inheritance tax, and this really shifted the government's source of revenue away from tariffs. What we see is the more income taxes the government starts to have, the less reliant they are on tariffs. Under Wilson, the Federal Reserve Act was established, and this created a new central banking system. It's not unlike the bus in some ways, and this would control the money supply, and they would set interest rates as well. Still around today, very influential. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act and allowed unions to be exempt from prosecution. So we started off talking about how under the Sherman Antitrust Act, unions were prosecuted. The Clayton Antitrust Act specifically exempted unions from prosecution. The Adamson Act created an 8-hour workday for railroad workers as well. Okay, finally, we'll finish up with his progressive legacies. African Americans were left out of many of the progressive reforms, virtually all of them. And Wilson screened the movie A Birth of a Nation at the White House. If you look at Birth of a Nation, this was the first full-length feature film, and it glorified the KKK during Reconstruction. All right, let's do a quick recap for Chapter 20. Know the Pendleton Act and that it instituted civil service exams. The Sherman Antitrust Act and how it inadvertently was used against unions. The Populist Party and the Omaha Platform, written by Ignatius-Donnelly. Know that. Coxey's Army, what did he want? Was he successful? Cross of gold and free silver, what are they calling for? Why are they doing that? Roosevelt, the antitrust legislation and conservation, definitely know that. Wisconsin idea and La Follette. The election of 1912, who were the people running and why did Wilson win? And what were Wilson's economic reforms, the Federal Reserve Act, taxes, Clayton Antitrust Act, etc. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you right back here for Chapter 21. We're going to figure out why on earth is Teddy Roosevelt pointing a gigantic cannon in this dude's face. We will get into it in the next chapter. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the section below. Best of luck to every single test you take, especially the one in May. You're brilliant. You will do well. And I will see you guys right back here. Have a good day.